One can argue that the pulls and pressures on the finances have not been more stark in the last few years, except for exceptional years like the COVID years, simply because the West is entering a period of slowdown and India has to deal with a lot of issues aside of the global slowdown impacting its own growth. In such a situation, the backdrop against which the budget is coming out is as crucial as the statements itself. And who better to talk about what to watch out for than Sajjid Chinoy of JP Morgan. He joins me and Pallavi on this conversation. Sajjid, great having you. Thanks for joining in.
Great to be here, Neeraj. Hi, Pallavi.
Sajjid, can we just start off with a basic question? The backdrop against which this budget is coming out, how critical, how crucial, and how do you read about it?
I think that's a great place to start, Neeraj, because this may seem kind of unbelievable given what's happened over the last year. But policy making over the next 12 months could be even more tricky and involve a greater balancing act than the last 12 months. Think about where we were last time this year. This was before the Russia-Ukraine war. This was still a time last January where some central banks thought around the world that inflation was transitory. And so the intellectual consensus was clear. We were coming out of the pandemic. Economies were recovering. Fiscal policy around the world had provided much support. And the decision and debate in the budget was how much support do we pull back? And that was essentially what the debate involved. This year, we're in a whole new gambit because what we've seen in the last 12 months is both a supply shock and a demand shock simultaneously. The Russia-Ukraine war has meant that just as the supply shock from the pandemic was fading, manufacturing supply chains were normalizing, we saw another supply shock. This time it was around food and energy, right? And has pushed up inflation around the world. To counter that, central banks have undertaken the most aggressive, coordinated monetary tightening since the 1980s, right? And the combination of both these things places emerging markets in a very tricky situation in the next 12 months. Because on the one hand, will have to anticipate a slowdown globally, and India can't fully escape that. So we think even in a benign situation, global growth will go from 3% in 22 to something like 1.7 or 1.8% in 2023. So there's going to be a meaningful slowdown globally, and India won't be able to fully escape that. Now, that ordinarily would mean policy should be more supportive. But at the same time, inflation really hasn't rolled off. We still have sticky core inflation. In many emerging markets, current account deficits are still at uncomfortable levels because commodity prices, though having come off, are still quite elevated. So I think from the budget's perspective, this has to be a careful balancing act where the budget's focus will have to be on macroeconomic stability while also being mindful of the slowdown in growth that is upon us in the coming quarters.
Yeah. And Sajjid, therein lies the question, about the fact that there is a glide path or a path around fiscal deficit that I believe the markets would anticipate the government to take, even if it's the pre-election year, so to say, and one would understand that there'll be excess spending. But two, also the nature of the spend, whether it is done on capex and infrastructure related items, or does it go into the other end, which will aid the rural consumer, but not quite something that might sit well with markets at large. Now, how do you think the navigation through both of these line items might happen?
So first, let's focus on what sort of the macroeconomic stability part and then the growth part. For the macro stability part, I think there are two elements. One is to continue doggedly with fiscal consolidation because our starting points are elevated. If you look at the central deficit, state deficits, PSU borrowing, we're still close to 10% of GDP, and that will warrant we have to bring those deficits down. Now, in the last couple of years, the fiscal marksmanship has been very good. Each time the government has met its fiscal deficit target or actually beaten it, right? And this again was a very difficult year, lots of fiscal pressures, and the government deserves a lot of credit to reiterate it will stick to 6.4%. So I think the first thing to do is from a market perspective is take away uncertainty. And the government's committed to a 2% of GDP glide path over the next 3 years. And I think that's the right pace. So I think if we get about 0.5, 0.6% of GDP consolidation this year, the deficit goes from 6.4 to 5.8 or 5.9. That will be very much in line with what markets expect and therefore will take away the uncertainty. Secondly, I think having some kind of medium-term fiscal anchor will be useful, because in an environment of so much uncertainty, both globally and domestically, I think the best thing that policy can do is, reduce uncertainty, create stability, constancy, consistency. So having some kind of medium-term debt anchor, whether we want to stabilize debt at current levels or gradually bring it down, will just give markets, investors, ratings agencies something to peg their hat on, right? I think do two things. It in a way, the uncertainty reduces any remaining risk premium in bond markets, so monetary conditions will ease, and it allows firms, investors to plan, to say, here's what the fiscal path's going to be, here's what the debt trajectory is going to be, here's what the borrowing requirements are going to be, and all of that helps the private sector, as hopefully we're getting slowly closer to a capex cycle.
Okay.
So that was on the stability part. On the growth part, Neeraj, just to answer your question, I think we have to accept that when deficits come down at the margin, that impinges on demand. But I think, again, another area where the government's been very good is prioritizing capital expenditure. And I can't say enough about this. I've been a big supporter of this for the last 3 years, but the government decided in 2020 that sustained public investment, infrastructure spending was going to be India's kind of ticket out of the pandemic, and the job creation that comes with it, I think is crucial to recovering from this pandemic. Now, the government's put its money where the mouth is. Central capex over the last 3 years has increased from 1.7% of GDP to 2.7%, a whole percentage point in 3 years. Some of it, admittedly, is loan to states. Some of it is what used to be on public sector enterprises coming on the center's balance sheet. But that doesn't matter from an economy-wide standpoint, as long as infrastructure assets are being created and jobs are being created. And I think from a growth perspective, the quality of spending will matter. If aggregate deficits are coming down, the way you support growth is increasing spending that has higher multipliers. If you think about the ratio of revenue expenditure to capital expenditure, 3 years ago, this used to be about 4.5 to 1. And that in the last 3 years has come down to 2.5 to 1. So capex has gone up. And when I talk about revenue, I mean non-subsidy, no subsidies, no interest. So non-subsidy interest, revenue expenditure is down, capex is up. And I would argue that that is the approach to go forward. Deficit should come down for stability, but to the extent that capex keeps moving up and the quality of expenditure is improving with larger multiplier effects, that's the best support that the budget can offer for growth.
Sorry, Pallavi, just one quick follow-up, Sajjid, to this question, and before I hand it over to Pallavi, is that do you reckon with the buoyancy in tax seen in the year gone by, yes, but that because of the nominal GDP coming off as well, if there is likely to reduce, this investment is not quite out there in terms of the receipts almost any single year. Does the government have the necessary wherewithal to be able to stay on the path of higher capex, at the same time trying to boost the rural consumers' sentiment by spending on whether it's free food or subsidy or what have you in a pre-election year, which might become a bit of a critical element?
Yeah. So here's how I would think about it, about the fiscal math for next year. If we end at 6.4% of GDP this year, and we're budgeting 0.5% of consolidation, there's a pretty straightforward path to get there. And at some level, the government's already done the heavy lifting. What you saw in December, I think, was a deft manner in which the food subsidy bill was tapered. Remember, we had the food subsidy under the National Food Security Program, and then there was a special allowance on the pandemic. Now, those got combined and rationalized. And by our calculations, that alone next year, lower food subsidies and some tapering of fertilizer subsidies, because global fertilizer prices are down, should shave off 0.5% of GDP, right? So you can achieve the entire consolidation for next year by just sticking to what the current layout is for subsidies. And the fact that you rationalize food and will have a chance to rationalize fertilizer gives you the fiscal space. Now, what does that mean? It means that you can budget tax revenues quite conservatively. So we'll end up with gross tax to GDP, by our estimates, a whole percentage point higher this year than was budgeted. The budget was 10.2. If you remember when we spoke a year ago, I said that they were being very conservative. and we've got that higher tax buoyancy. Buoyancy has been about 1.2 or 1.3 this year, but we have to be realistic. Next year, as growth slows, both nominal and real, buoyancy is going to come down. Even if you assume a buoyancy of 1, so essentially the math is whatever tax to GDP you have this year, if you assume a buoyancy of 1, tax to GDP does not fall next year. The disinvestment next year is the same as this year. So your receipt side is very much the same. On the expenditure side, you're getting 0.5% of GDP in savings from the food and subsidy being tapered and fertilizer being down. And that allows you to consolidate. Now, the rest of it then has to be a division between CapEx and revenue expenditures. And my preference would be do a little more CapEx to the extent that absorptive capacity exists, and at the margin keep tapering revenue expenditure. So I think that's one way to satisfy all of these different objectives.
All right. Sajjid, so you've touched upon CAPEX. So can we expect that CAPEX growth will not be to the tune of what we have seen the past 2 years, though CAPEX will no doubt remain elevated?
So the first thing I'd like to see is for capital expenditure in the budget just to be in line with nominal GDP. Now, nominal GDP growth, I think, should be in the range of 10 to 11%. Remember, the last 2 years, it was 18 and 15. As we are experiencing disinflation, we will get lower nominal GDP. So at a minimum, we want capital expenditure to grow by 10 or 11%. So the share of GDP is the same. The fact that CapEx has gone from 1.7 to 2.7, if we can keep it there, that's a good start. Ideally, if I'm being picky, I'd like it to go up by a little bit more to the extent that absorptive capacity exists. But Pallavi, I think the larger CapEx question is not with the center, but with the states and the PSUs. Because if you look at the first 7-8 months data, we're seeing that state CapEx really hasn't picked up. PSUs, have to also catch up. So what I really would look for in FY24 is not just the center sticking to its CapEx commitments, but getting support from states, getting support from PSUs. Some of it may be execution constraints, some of it may be financial constraints, but all stakeholders have to get together, because my personal view is that given the macro uncertainty globally, given that growth is going to slow both globally and domestically, a broad-based corporate investment cycle will still take time. Utilization rates are still at 75, 76%. In an environment where you worry about a global recession, and you've seen the most aggressive monetary tightening in 40 years, it's understandable corporates will want to be patient and wait it out. So it's important that the counter-cyclical public investment push that we've seen the last 2-3 years continue for one more year. We should not be taking our foot off the pedal in the belief that the corporate CapEx cycle is imminent. And therefore, it really matters what the center does, but also what the state does.
How well does all of this tie in with the advance estimates we saw for the current fiscal year?
So the advance estimates, I think, are very realistic. I think most market participants have growth somewhere between 6.8 and 7%. So we should expect 7% growth. But I think the key is to realize just the contribution that exports have made to India's recovery in the last 2 years. So the year before, when we grew at 8.7%, exports contributed 3 percentage points to that 8.7% growth. They were punching much above their weight. Now, as the global economy, and that was the year where global growth was 6%. Now, global growth slowed to 3% this year, and that contribution from exports went from 3 percentage points to about 1.8 percentage points as per the advanced estimates. Now, we've got to be realistic. Next year, as global growth goes from 3 to 1.7, exports contribution will be even less. So we have to brace for the fact and be realistic that with the contribution of exports falling so much, and with the fact that policy, monetary and fiscal has been tightened in India, correctly so, that this is going to weigh on domestic demand, this is going to weigh on growth. And, so we need to be realistic that growth is going to slow next year, and therefore the budget will need to account for that.
Just considering the growth risks that you've touched upon, the government also needs to be careful to not tighten too much in that case?
That's exactly right, which is why I began by saying, there is a 2% of GDP consolidation over the next 3 years. This doesn't need to be linear. I think about 0.5% this year, would be par for the course, just given the growth risk that we anticipate down the road. And hopefully a year from now, when any kind of global slowdown or recession is behind us, it'll be the first year of the next government's term. And then one can front load the consolidation then and do much more at that point in time when you've got more confidence that domestic and global growth are rebounding. So I think 0.5% is right, but I think the government in general, we must admit, have been in the fiscal budgeting in the last 3 years has been, very transparent. It's been very conservative, both in terms of and realistic in terms of deficit reduction and the revenue side, and it's been very efficient in the sense that CapEx has been prioritized over revenue expenditure. So I think those same three principles of being realistic about taxes and consolidation, being transparent, and being efficient in terms of expenditure delivery, I think those should again be the hallmark for this year.
Neeraj?
Yeah, Sajjid, from a statement perspective for the next year, what would the money markets take away from? What would make you believe that the money markets, both the bond and the rupee markets, would be happy with? And what is it that might worry them?
So I think what bond markets will be kind of happy with or relaxed with is just no unpleasant surprises. I think bond markets have internalized the fact that we're going to get a 0.5, 0.6% of consolidation. There's a 2% of GDP consolidation for the next 3 years. There is a belief that maybe there's a little bit more borrowing that could happen for this year, because even if you stick to your deficit of 6.4%, it's of a larger denominator. Nominal GDP this year will be higher, but that's also something bond markets have internalized. But to be fair, Neeraj, bond markets borrowing costs are actually much lower. Remember, last year everybody fretted about how would all of this borrowing go through if the central bank would not buy bonds. Credit growth picked up and everybody was really worried. But if you think about real GSEC yields, right? So we have to think about GSEC yields, but deflate them by core inflation. They used to be 2.5% pre-pandemic. They're now 1%. So despite the fact that deficits have been larger, and the borrowing has been higher, the bond market has absorbed this very well. Part of it is because, to be fair, state borrowing was lower. Part of it is because we're seeing much greater demand at the long end by insurance and pension. Non-bank sources has gone up very sharply. And part of it is because, a corporate capex cycle is still going to take time. So the government can afford to run larger deficits without necessarily crowding out. So I would say from a bond market perspective, real bond yields are very comfortable. If there are no large unpleasant surprises, which I don't foresee in terms of deficit numbers and borrowing numbers, I think the borrowing program should go through, without any incident in the coming year.
Just one quick follow-up on how do you see the math for the currency playing up, simply because if indeed, as you also rightly alluded to, if the world markets are coming off and therefore export revenue goes down, whereas the imports are largely non-negotiable, even if there is a pleasant development of crude prices having come off, anything in the budget that might be of significance, Sajjid?
So just a couple of quick observations on this. One is that, fundamentally, the fiscal deficit and current account deficit are intimately linked, because the current account deficit is simply, on a more fundamental basis, the investment minus savings gap, which is the consolidated fiscal deficit and the private sector investment savings gap. So if we want the private sector to actually grow in the coming years and for an investment cycle to pick up, and we want the current account deficit to stay contained, then the fiscal has to consolidate. And that's why these twin deficits are so important to each other's fortunes. But here's another point. The glass half empty, we all know that the current account was under pressure for the first 6-7 months of this year. The balance of payments was under pressure. The RBI has a lot of reserves. But the good news has been that progressively, expectations that the current account would reach 4% of GDP, back in 6 months ago, most people now have it at 3% or a tad less. Some of it is because commodities have come off and crude is at 80 versus 100. But there's another very pleasant development, which is India's service exports are doing remarkably well. Right? So if you look at growth of service exports, they're almost 30% over the previous year. Now that's a nominal number. When you deflate that, It's high in real terms, still higher than 20% above. These are IT exports, IT-enabled services that actually, management consulting, R&D, other sources of offshoring. And so the promise that the pandemic would result in more digitalization, more work from home, more offshoring, India is seeing that play out very clearly in the macro data. So for me, that's a huge tailwind to the balance of payments, that our share of global services that used to be 3.1, 3.2% of the global market 5 years ago is now higher than 4%. The offset to that, as you alluded, is very sticky non-oil, non-gold imports. So in a way, the current account comes down to a tug of war, that as the global economy slows, will some of the service buoyancy slow? And as India's economy slows, will non-oil, non-gold imports soften? And where this tug of war resolves will be crucial to the current account prospects. But the fact is, at the margin, things have become less worrying because commodities are down, the dollar is weaker, and you've got the tailwind from service exports.
Time for one last question. Pallavi, you want to take that?
Yes, you can go ahead.
Okay, great. Sajjid, so the final question would, from mine at least, would be, what's the impetus on growth do you reckon the government would explicitly lay out at a point of time when growth world over might be constrained, and naturally as an impact of that, the Indian growth numbers might not, despite the best efforts, look as hunky-dory? I mean, it's one thing to set up CapEx, but quite another for that CapEx to see fruition in terms of demand from the West, at least, if not the other markets.
Exactly, which is why any private investment cycle, I think, could take time. And to be fair, I think the one area where there's a little more hope and optimism is on the residential real estate cycle. But a broader corporate CapEx cycle could take time. What do we need to do for growth? A, I think we need to be patient and realize the global setting we're in. But B, I think, for me, it's all about jobs, jobs, jobs. The fact is, if you look at the demand side, exports, imports, gross fixed capital formation and consumption, while consumption is making a smart recovery, it's still the slowest sector to recover on the demand side. And that's to be expected because you need an even more sustained jobs recovery, right? So really the focus has to be jobs, jobs, jobs. That means that, continue with public investment, because hopefully that construction work will create jobs at the bottom of the pyramid and alleviate some of the scarring from the pandemic. It means continuing to do reforms to grab this, once in a lifetime opportunity. We forget that China, quite apart from, China plus one and French shoring, China is vacating large amounts of space in the labor-intensive, unskilled, low-skilled manufacturing. Textile, ceramics, plastics, gems and jewelry. That is India's comparative advantage. That's what we have to latch on to. Now, that's going to take time. But I think we need to put in place the preconditions for India to become competitive in labor-intensive manufacturing to grab that Chinese opportunity. So if growth slows this year, we just have to bite the bullet. The question is, what do we do to boost potential growth over the next 3-5 years? I think grabbing the export opportunity, focusing on infrastructure, and continuing with more reforms will be what I'll be looking for.
Would it be a scope of the budget this year, or could it be done something throughout the year as the government has done in PLI, for example?
I think this is very much a process, not an event. So I think it will be good for the budget to reiterate, some of these measures taken, objectives. I'll say one other thing. I think in a world where there's more deglobalization, it's important for India to buck that trend. Import tariffs, there could be a clamor from domestic industry, but import tariffs are exactly equivalent to export taxes. So if we want to join global supply chains, and boost exports over the next 5 years, we have to be careful about kind of tariff rationalization as well.
From Pallavi, me and the team that has just done this show, Sajjid, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your thoughts. Really appreciate your time.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Viewers, thanks for tuning in.